There are mountains that swallow armies and valleys that bury empires. For Britain, Afghanistan was one such place, a land unconquered not by strength of steel, but by spirit. From the passes of the Hindu Kush to the dust of Kandahar, every step of conquest turned into retreat. The British called it strategy. History called it obsession. 3 wars, 3 humiliations, each more haunting than the last. In chasing control of the East, the empire met its own limits. And in the silence of those mountains, a question still echoes. Why must every empire test the land that cannot be tamed? In the 19th century, the world was being carved up like a grand chessboard. To the British, the jewel of India gleamed brightest, and beyond it lay the shadow of the Russian Empire. Between them stretched Afghanistan, a rugged buffer of mountains, tribes, and pride. Neither empire could claim it, yet neither could ignore it. This rivalry became legend, the Great Game, a silent war of spies, schemes, and shifting alliances. London's policymakers saw Afghanistan not as a nation, but as a corridor, a defense line to protect their crown jewel from the northern bear. The Afghans, however, saw their land as sacred, indivisible, and their sovereignty as non-negotiable. The British underestimated that resolve, as all empires do when blinded by maps and ambition. It began with whispers in Whitehall and dispatches from India. Russian envoys sighted near Kabul, British officers urging preemptive control. Fear disguised itself as strategy. The empire that had mastered oceans now feared the mountains. By 1839, with confidence sharpened by arrogance, Britain invaded, believing Afghan loyalty could be purchased and its terrain subdued. But beneath the banners of empire lay something they did not understand, a land where allegiance flowed through bloodlines, not treaties, where every pass and village was a fortress of memory. In that misunderstanding, the seeds of disaster were already sown. The first British invasion of Afghanistan began not with fury, but with confidence, a confidence born from empire, arrogance, and ignorance. In 1839, 20,000 soldiers marched through the Bolan Pass, dragging with them the trappings of British civility, silver tea sets, fine wine, and an army of camp followers. They called it a civilizing mission. The Afghans called it invasion. At first, Kabul fell easily. Shah Shuja, the puppet king chosen by the British, was installed upon the throne. The empire congratulated itself, convinced it had secured the gateway to India. But empires often mistake quiet for peace. Beneath the surface, Afghan resentment boiled. Tribes united under a single cause, to expel the foreigner who dared claim their mountains. Winter came, and with it, rebellion. One by one, outposts fell. The British garrisons, lulled by illusion, were surrounded by ghosts of their own making. The retreat from Kabul in January 1842 became a frozen march of death, 16,000 men, women, and children trudging through snow and ambush. Only one man reached Jalalabad alive. One, to tell the tale. Back in London, disbelief turned to silence. The empire that spanned continents had been humbled by shepherds and tribesmen. The lesson was clear but unlearned, that no army can conquer a land that fights with memory instead of muskets. And yet, as history would show, Britain was far from done testing that truth. Winter, 1842. The mountains around Kabul were white with silence, the kind that precedes tragedy. Britain's army, once 16,000 strong, marched through the narrow passes of snow and stone, not as conquerors, but as ghosts of their own hubris. The retreat from Kabul was not a battle. It was a slow unraveling of empire, mile by frozen mile. The Afghans struck like the wind, unseen, patient, merciless. Every ridge became a trap, every shadow a threat. The soldiers, burdened by pride and frostbite, stumbled through blizzards where direction, like reason, vanished. Civilians, officers, camp followers, all were consumed by the cold and by the fury of men defending their land. By the time the massacre ended in the mountain pass at Gandamak, nearly all were dead. Only one survivor, Dr. William Britton, reached Jalalabad, half conscious, half alive, to deliver the empire's shame. His horse collapsed beneath him, a living emblem of what the empire had lost. Not merely an army, but the illusion of control. The retreat from Kabul became a legend whispered across centuries, proof that no empire, however vast, can command the will of a people bound by their land and faith. Afghanistan had not defeated Britain with numbers, but with endurance. And as the snow melted, it revealed not victory or conquest, but the bones of arrogance scattered across the mountains. Empires often mistake defeat for delay. In London, the shock of Kabul rippled through Parliament, the press, and the pride of a nation that could not accept humiliation from what it saw as a mountain tribe. The retreat had been a disaster, but instead of reflection, Britain reached for rationalization. The empire told itself that Afghanistan had been mishandled, not unconquerable. In polished rooms far from the Hindu Kush, generals redrew maps with quiet arrogance. Reports softened words like massacre into misfortune. The dead became lessons, the catastrophe a temporary reversal. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the truth lingered like frost. Afghanistan was a place where ambition froze, and every path forward led back to humility. Those few who had survived the retreat spoke of villages that had burned, of negotiations that had turned to betrayal, of cold so cruel that even memory refused to keep it. But such testimonies were inconvenient for empire. It was easier to believe the fault lay not in intent, but in execution. The British withdrew, but only in body. In spirit, the obsession deepened, a quiet vow to return, to reclaim the illusion of mastery. The lesson that should have been learned, that Afghanistan could not be possessed, was buried beneath pride. In the corridors of power, a familiar rhythm began again, strategies drawn from ignorance, confidence built upon denial. The empire would march once more into the same mountains, under the same banner, chasing the same mirage, convinced that this time, history would bend. Empires rarely retreat without leaving shadows behind. When the drums of the Second Anglo-Afghan War began to beat, Britain framed it as necessity, not obsession. Russia's approach through Central Asia gave London the excuse it needed, a new threat to mask an old desire. Once more, British troops crossed the mountain passes, their banners bright against the pale dust of Afghanistan's high valleys. But this was not conquest, it was repetition. Kabul and Kandahar became names echoing with déjà vu. Villages watched in silence as red-coated columns advanced, promising order but bringing smoke. The empire spoke of protection and diplomacy, yet its footsteps carried the same arrogance that had once frozen in the snow. Beneath the formal proclamations of stability lay a deep misunderstanding, that Afghanistan was not a prize to claim, but a spirit to respect. This time, the British entered with strategy and numbers, believing lessons had been learned. Forts rose, treaties were signed, and envoys were placed like pieces on a chessboard. Yet even the best-laid plans faltered in a land that refused to be measured by maps. The mountains did not yield, they watched. The people did not submit, they waited. By 1880, the cycle reached its breaking point. Kandahar burned with revolt, and the empire once again tasted the bitterness of withdrawal disguised as victory. The war had changed little but proved much, that no matter how refined the strategy or modern the weapon, Afghanistan's resistance was not born of defiance but of identity. It could be fought, but never owned. Kandahar, the city of sun and stone, had seen empires rise and dissolve like dust storms. By the late 1870s, it became the beating heart of Afghanistan's resistance. What began as a British outpost of stability turned into a symbol of rebellion. The empire believed it could fortify loyalty with walls, but loyalty here was not built with stone. It was born from blood, memory, and the whisper of freedom carried through narrow alleys and desert winds. When Ayub Khan, the victor of Maiwand, rallied his men against the foreign presence, Kandahar ignited. His army was not vast, but his cause was boundless. From mountain tribes to city dwellers, Afghans united under one truth: their land would not kneel. The British forces, though disciplined and heavily armed, found themselves surrounded not by soldiers, but by belief itself. Every rifle shot carried centuries of defiance. The Battle of Maiwand became a wound and a warning. Thousands fell, and British prestige bled into the earth. Yet within that loss, the empire's illusion of control shattered. The retreat from Kandahar was not just military, it was psychological. It marked the point where imperial ambition began to question its own shadow. As the survivors marched away beneath a burning sky, they looked back at a city they could never truly conquer. Kandahar stood untouched in spirit, proud, scarred, and unbroken. The empire would write reports of bravery and tactical withdrawal, but history remembered something else, that in the heart of Afghanistan, resistance is not an act, it is inheritance. By 1919, the world had bled through a great war, and Britain's empire was weary, stretched thin from Europe to the edges of Asia. Yet, even in exhaustion, it turned once more toward Afghanistan. The third invasion was not born from ambition, but anxiety. The empire feared that Bolshevik whispers from the north would find fertile ground in Kabul. But for the Afghans, this was not a war of politics. It was the final act of a century-long defiance. Amanullah Khan, young and unyielding, rose not with the might of numbers, but with the conviction of sovereignty. He declared Afghanistan independent in both spirit and policy, a message that thundered louder than any cannon. British troops crossed the Khyber once again, expecting another quick campaign. But the empire no longer marched with certainty. It limped under the weight of past ghosts. Every hill, every valley, carried echoes of its earlier failures. The fighting was fierce but brief, less a battle, more an unraveling. Afghan fighters, hardened by generations of war, fought not for land, but for dignity. When the guns fell silent, Britain signed the Treaty of Rawalpindi, recognizing Afghanistan's full independence. What began as an empire's assertion ended as its concession. In the burning heat of 1919, the British learned a truth written long before their arrival. Afghanistan could be entered, but never owned. The frontier that once glittered with imperial promise had become a mirror reflecting decline. The Third Anglo-Afghan War was not just the end of conflict, it was the end of illusion. The empire had reached its limit, and beyond it lay humility, hard-earned and irreversible. The story of empire is often told through generals and treaties, but the true weight of the Anglo-Afghan Wars was borne by the nameless, the soldiers who froze in the passes, the villagers who fled burning homes, the children who grew up beneath the sound of foreign drums. Between ambition and resistance lay only suffering, spread evenly across the mountains like ash. For every flag raised, a family vanished. For every victory claimed, a village was silenced. British soldiers marched through unfamiliar terrain, their letters home filled with both awe and despair. They wrote of landscapes that swallowed men whole, of comrades who vanished into snow or smoke. The Afghans, too, carried scars, not just of battle, but of survival. Their resistance was carved into memory, passed down as stories whispered around fires, shaping the nation's soul more deeply than any border ever could. Local leaders, tribal elders, clerics, and chieftains found themselves navigating impossible choices. To side with the British was to risk betrayal. To resist was to invite annihilation. Yet again and again, they chose resistance. Not because victory was assured, but because surrender meant erasing everything that made them Afghan. In that defiance lived a quiet nobility, a belief that freedom was worth any cost. By the time the last rifles fell silent, the soil itself seemed to mourn. Graves outnumbered banners, and the wind through the Khyber whispered the names of the lost. Empires record their triumphs in ink, but Afghanistan remembers in blood and dust. The human cost was not collateral. It was the very currency of empire, and the debt has never truly been paid. Mountains have their own kind of memory, and in Afghanistan, they remember every trespass. For centuries, invaders believed they could tame the terrain with discipline and firepower. Yet each British column that entered the narrow valleys found not pathways, but traps. The land itself conspired with its people. Cliffs became fortresses, ridges became ambush lines, and every turn hid both silence and death. The British maps told lies of straight routes and easy crossings. What they did not show were the unyielding slopes, the shifting snows, the invisible tribes watching from above. Geography became strategy, and strategy became a grave. Armies that had conquered continents were reduced to broken files of men struggling against wind and rock, their bright uniforms dulled by dust and fear. The mountains were not obstacles, they were adversaries. Afghanistan's geography offered no mercy. Roads turned into rivers in spring, deserts into traps by summer. Even supply lines were swallowed whole. For the Afghans, this terrain was home, a weapon more reliable than any rifle. They moved like the wind and struck like ghosts, then vanished into the folds of the land that had birthed them. For Britain, the geography of failure was more than physical. It was a landscape of misunderstanding, a refusal to see that no empire can hold what it does not comprehend. In those valleys, the empire learned too late that the earth itself can resist occupation. Empires often fall not by the sword, but by the blindness of certainty. In Afghanistan, Britain's greatest weapon was also its greatest flaw, the conviction that its order could overwrite centuries of culture. Officers wrote dispatches filled with confidence, yet they never truly saw the people before them. The tribes they called rebels were not anarchists but guardians of autonomy. The villages they deemed backward were societies bound by honor and lineage, not chaos. The British brought treaties written in a language few could read and promises bound to a loyalty few wanted. They mistook silence for submission and smiles for trust. Every gesture, every refusal, carried meanings they could not interpret. To the Afghans, these strangers seemed powerful but hollow, men who fought for empire, not for home. The war was no longer about land, but dignity. At lavish encampments, British officers toasted victories that never lasted beyond sunrise. They admired Afghan landscapes while misunderstanding their soul. Where the locals saw sacred valleys, the empire saw strategic passes. Where the Afghans valued patience, Britain demanded speed. Each misreading widened the gulf until diplomacy itself became impossible. Imperial hubris thrives on distance, the illusion that control equals understanding. In Afghanistan, that illusion shattered. The British learned, too late, that no nation can conquer a people it refuses to know. What they saw as savagery was sovereignty. What they called rebellion was remembrance. History would call it arrogance paid in blood. The dust of empire never truly settles. It drifts, shaping maps, memories, and the myths that follow. From the ashes of Britain's Afghan wars rose borders drawn not by the mountains, but by mistakes. The Durand Line, sketched in distant offices, sliced through tribes, valleys, and bloodlines, a line that still divides hearts more than it defines nations. What the British once called frontier policy became a wound that never closed, inherited by generations who never agreed to it. The empire may have left, but its ghost lingers in every checkpoint and every uneasy silence between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The old language of control transformed into the new language of diplomacy. Softer words, same tension. The myths Britain spun to justify invasion, of bringing order to chaos, civilization to wilderness, became the very stories that history would later unmake. For Afghanistan, the myth was survival. For Britain, the myth was mastery. Even today, echoes of those wars ripple through policy rooms and battlefields alike. Nations still repeat the same fatal logic. That might ensures understanding, that intervention guarantees peace. Yet the mountains remember otherwise. Afghanistan remains unconquered, not by strength alone, but by its refusal to be simplified. In the end, the Anglo-Afghan Wars were less about victory and more about reflection. They revealed the fragility of empire and the endurance of identity. Borders may fade on paper, but the lessons etched in those high passes endure, a warning carved in dust and pride. Afghanistan has never been a land that could be owned, only endured. Every empire that entered believed its maps, its machines, and its might would rewrite the landscape. Yet here, time does not bend to ambition. It humbles it. The land itself is the first and final ruler, and every invader becomes another echo swallowed by the mountains. The British called it the graveyard of empires. But graves imply rest, and there is none here. The lessons of arrogance, geography, and resistance rise again with every generation that underestimates this place. The terrain is not merely physical, it's psychological, spiritual, a labyrinth where certainty goes to die. Empires fail here because they misunderstand victory. To conquer land is not to command loyalty. To impose borders is not to build peace. Power without respect, technology without humility, these collapse faster than armies retreating through snow. And so, Afghanistan stands, scarred, unbroken, watching history repeat itself in the dust. Its silence speaks louder than any anthem. Empires fade, names change, but the mountains remain, whispering the same truth to all who listen. Those who come to rule leave learning how to survive. Empires fall, but stories remain, carved into stone, sung through generations, whispered through dust. The Anglo-Afghan Wars were not just battles of armies, but of arrogance against endurance, ambition against time itself. In every retreat, every failed campaign, humanity was forced to confront the truth that power fades, but memory does not. Here on After Time, we search for the echoes that outlive empires, the moments that define how history breathes through us still. The mountains of Afghanistan remind us that conquest is temporary, but understanding is eternal. If this story moved you, let it travel further. Like, share, and subscribe to After Time, where history is not just told, but felt. Because every ending hides a beginning, and every silence holds a story waiting to be remembered. This is After Time, where history slows and meaning stands still.